This week is, well, kind of rough for enterprise security news, but we're going to talk about ServiceNow buying a threat intelligence company, memory scanning in the hypervisor, next generation network segmentation, and NAC. Then John and I will discuss the evolution of IDS and IPS. All that and more, so stay tuned. This is a Security Weekly production. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Enterprise Security Weekly, where we read the security vendors' press releases so you don't have to. That's right, we're broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined on the lines via Skype by Mr. John Strand. Welcome, John.
Howdy-ho.
Yes, and it's been a very not so interesting sort of week. For the news was kind of, I don't know. I was waiting for kind of a slow week, and this is what I would define as a slow week for enterprise security news.
Yeah, we're going to get flamed again. We should talk a little bit about getting flamed from last week. But
I think it's part of it is just getting flamed.
Yeah. It's just the way it goes. But right. I know that we're going to have some of these vendors contact us and say, this is really important and earth-shattering for these following 5 reasons. And our eyes will just glass over and knock back into our skull because we can't handle the tedium of what they're talking about.
We're not saying that some things aren't important. We're just saying that some things just bore us to tears.
I think that sums it up very well.
And we read all of those boring things and report on them well, not that this is boring. This is actually kind of interesting. ServiceNow has expanded their security offering by adding John's favorite threat intelligence. That's right. They acquired Brightpoint Security. So now ServiceNow in February, they moved into the security space, offering configuration management and integration of vulnerability data along with IT operations. Now they're adding threats and from threat intelligence sources provided by the recently acquired Brightpoint to respond to threats. Sounds like a lot of moving pieces, but it's difficult to tell exactly how this could help, although Security Now, in their foray into the security space, says that there was an article, a good article by Diginomicon, Derek DePries, said ServiceNow wants to get security teams using the same platform as IT buyers, bringing the two functions closer together, reducing the time it takes to respond to threats, which is a continuing theme we've seen this year, John.
Yeah, and I think the cloud is mentioned at least 2 to 3 times.
That's standard in any press release. They have to say cloud, next generation, real time, very important terms to use.
No APTs in this one.
No APTs in this one, which is interesting because they say they can detect threats.
But they can't. It's apparently the advanced persistent ones blow right by. No, I'm joking. So this isn't as bad. What was that? I can't remember what the press release was last week, where they had 7 buzzwords.
Yeah, this one was not as bad as that one.
It was beautiful. So this goes back to what we've been talking about. I think that this is the third type of company where they have that managed IT infrastructure support and they're tying in security. This is the first one that we've talked about where they're actually tying in threat intelligence feeds into it. And this is interesting because do you think there's actually more value in tying it into more of a unified IT platform, threat intelligence feeds, than it being a standalone security product? Is kind of what I got thinking. Because if you have that kind of unified IT posture, then you have more control over, settings for browsers, for example, or basically tying things through for proxies that exist. You can actually hit more points more effectively with something like ServiceNow implementing threat intelligence? Or do you think, Paul, that this is just, hey, they're mixing things together and hoping it sticks in the marketplace?
Yeah, this could go one of two ways. They could acquire this company, integrate the data, and just be like, hey, here's some threat intelligence data. Have fun with it, which is what a lot of people are trying to do with threat intelligence data, and it often doesn't work out very well. However, if the integration is they're using the threat intelligence data to qualify threats that are based on data they're pulling from their configuration management, data that they're pulling from the vulnerability sources, and integrating all three of those things together and actually doing real correlation so that you don't have to do as much of that work, I think it's a good thing. My concern here is this ongoing trend of merging security and IT. Now, traditionally, security group is separate from IT, and I think the groups are separate, but once you start merging them together a little by sharing some of the same common tools, that can be good, right? Things can get done faster. However, I think traditionally security was separate because it's the oversight committee for networking and operations and systems administration. So you can't have the watchers, the doers being the watchers. You know what I'm saying? There needs to be some kind of audit component to it and security monitoring that is in fact separate from IT. You can't have someone in IT operations going, I see that threat over there, but I'm not going to do anything about that. So it's going to be really dicey as we see this merger between IT and security, which is apparently becoming a trend this year.
Yeah, and I hope also this is bidirectional. ServiceNow is buying Brightpoint, which is cool. And they maybe start implementing the quote unquote threat intelligence feeds back into what ServiceNow is doing. But I also think it should go the other way as well. Having real enterprises to actually draw that threat intelligence from could actually be something very, very, very cool if they actually leverage that properly. And for consultant speak, I already used the word leverage. I should say it might actually be a good synergy move as well, but it has to be in both directions for it to work properly. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Brocade buys Ruckus Wireless. I think these are just two companies with some pretty cool technology. There's not too much of a security angle here, other than in 2010, Ruckus was awarded a patent for a new Wi-Fi authentication and encryption scheme. And Ruckus has some really cool stuff. I mean, I remember using Brocade switches to do the fiber networking behind storage area networking. And I think largely a lot of that is being replaced by cloud, or at least starting to move in that direction, certainly. So I don't know. It's just kind of an FYI out there. I just thought it was interesting that Ruckus, when you look at their security, thought enough about it at least 6 years ago to go get a patent. So.
Well, and also Brocade, for a lot of our customers that use them, they love them. And Paul, we were talking about before, whenever we were setting up for the news stories, we've always liked Ruckus's products. They're really, really cool products. So this is actually one of those mergers where two cool companies are now merging together, and I think that that's a good thing. But I think the angle is, and this is strange, I don't know if this is actually going to work because it seems like it's a repeat from 8 years ago. But I'm seeing a lot of organizations that are like, we don't want to have wires in our offices anymore. We're going all wireless all the time, all over the place. And we're going to get rid of this Cat6 cable that we have running all over the place. Do you think that this is part of that? Like they're trying to make the wireless network now the predominant network inside of business locations?
Well, no, I think.
Or do you think that?
I think I have to sneeze. No, I think. Thank you. I think that people are still going to have wires, and I think people are going to still have wireless. But it's interesting. You're always going to have that infrastructure. And you're always going to have to be responsible for securing that infrastructure. I mean, even if, let's say, all of the management of your network and wireless goes up into the cloud, you're still going to have a physical presence in your networks, in your physical location. So we're always going to have to secure that stuff. There's always going to be people there using the wireless and the network that we're going to have to secure. So, when people say, well, all the security is moving in the cloud, well, no. I mean, Brocade and Ruckus are going to be in the networking and wireless space probably for a really long time because as John and I said, they make really cool technology. So this is still going to be a security concern for you and not something you can be like, oh, we're just going to put it in the cloud because you can't. And
I also see this one as a Cisco protection strategy. Cisco's in the wireless space. Cisco, of course, is in the switching and networking space without question. And the thing that's difficult, and we're seeing this as a pen testing company, is a lot of corporations, whenever they establish a relationship, they want to reduce the number of contractual relationships they have. So they want to find a security firm that does everything from scans for ASV scans to pen testing to doing firewall management. They want to do one-stop shopping and just work with that one company.
Yep.
And I see this as kind of a way to kind of stop Cisco. Because if Cisco gets in, let's say if they're the networking side and you're using something like Ruckus for your wireless, then your competitor is now in the network actively working against you because they've already got that wedge in the network, and then they'll eventually try to pivot and take the wireless. So let's see that as kind of a stopgap solution to try to prevent those all-in-one solution providers from taking over. So I think it's a good move. And I like we said, we like their products. It's very, very cool. But yeah, this does scream a little bit of a Cisco protection strategy to stop Cisco from wedging into networks and pulling out contracts.
Bitdefender had an interesting announcement this week. They are doing memory scanning inside the hypervisor for Zen. It sounds awesome, but here we go adding another layer, right? Each time we do so, it increases risk. So we add more software to help protect what we think is broken software, or cases where software could be broken. But what happens in this case where Bitdefender's new technology can do in-memory scanning inside the hypervisor? What happens if there's a vulnerability in Bitdefender software or the way they access that memory? Now we've just given attackers access to hypervisor memory, which could be very dangerous.
And there's a couple of cool things about this, though. And you're talking about the complexity of security and how that's the enemy of everything that we do. And you're absolutely right. And I got to thinking about what types of, if somebody wants to research what types of attacks this could actually help mitigate. I would say VM escape attacks, a number of them, not all of them, of course, but a number of the virtual machine escape techniques that are out there. I think that that's a good place to be, to have some type of protection. But there's such a small collection of attacks for virtual machine escape that it's very hard to say that this is a comprehensive solution for looking for those VM escape techniques. That's number one. Number two, if you're watching the memory on computer systems and you have the ability of actually hooking into that memory and doing analysis in that memory at a lower level, there are some attack techniques that exist. There's shadow walking was one that came out. I can't remember. I think it was Jamie Butler, Black and Black Hat of 2008 or 2009. Can't remember which. But what that does is if somebody tries to do a memory acquisition on a device with malware in it, the malware can page itself out of memory down to disk, wait for the memory acquisition to pass, and then page itself back in. And you're starting to see a lot of rootkits that are now becoming more aware of their environment and what's happening from a security perspective, seeing what type of monitoring is occurring. So I think that this is interesting from that perspective as well. Now, where this gets really, really cool is if you look at what they're providing now for this technology and that type of ability of doing analysis in memory for something like, Citrix and Zen. Amazon, I just found this out last week when Rich Vogel was at in Rapid, that Amazon doesn't have the capability of doing a memory acquisition on your AMIs yet. I don't know if you knew that or not, Paul.
No,
but I was very shocked by it.
So there's a protection layer that prevents Amazon from accessing the memory of your virtual instances.
But there should be a way for you to be able to download the memory of your instances to doing forensics analysis.
Right.
If you look at VMware, they have the capability of doing a snapshot, importing into something like Mandiant Redline, and doing analysis. And I'm bringing up all of this because this is interesting, that there's people that are starting to move into this space, and these guys what they're doing right now is actually kind of a little bit of trailblazing as far as doing memory analysis for cloud-based platforms and virtual machine platforms. So we'll have to watch this one for a little bit, but I think it's a really cool technology. Hopefully it gets a little bit more steam and you start seeing other vendors starting to implement it as well.
Our last story this week comes from Fortinet, who is jumping on we have IoT security and cloud and all that stuff bandwagon. And really what I'll spare you for having to go through all this, to me, this sounds like glorified network segmentation and NAC. Way back in the day, NAC was big when I was working at the university, and it was really about, we did network segmentation in NAC. Now they're calling it next generation IoT protection, when back in the day when we were doing network segmentation in NAC, we were concerned about printers, which is essentially much of the same concern that we're worried about these IoT devices that's just multiplied 10, 50, 100 times now because we have more devices than just printers that are accessing the network and running an embedded system inside of them. So it's interesting, John. We talk about how we recommend people should do network, and I'm sure this has been in a pen test report that we've done recently, right? We recommend network segmentation and authenticating things to the network as part of our recommendation. But doing that in a large network is really hard. I mean, how do you segment everything and determine what can talk to what inside of an enterprise network with more than 20,000 devices, and then also make the decision as to, who is going to authenticate and how are we going to authenticate them? And then based on an authentication and device identification, where are we going to put them? that's the concept of segmentation and NAC working together. I think it's a great concept. If there are people that are doing it really successfully, I want to hear from you. But from what you described, John, that's not necessarily the norm when you see people's networks.
No, it's pretty rare. There are some customers that we've dealt with specifically that have used Forescout. I've actually seen Forescout a number of times and I'm very impressed with Forescout. And what Fortinet is talking about here looks like kind of Forescout type functionality, and Fortinet actually has that type of network access control. And generally the way that works is whenever you plug in a device into a network and you do authenticate, let's say to a domain, it'll actually identify your computer system as a computer system supposed to be associated with this user ID in this specific domain group. And it will allow it to access the network, but it will restrict the access within that network. So if you have somebody that joins a network segment and they're on HR, then their network segmentation rules that apply to that specific group actually goes with that individual, which is great. And what's interesting is a lot of people that buy these technologies, interestingly enough, they're buying these technologies because their network is a freaking train wreck. You're talking about network access control. And for years, we always talked about segmentation. You have HR over here, you have accounting over there, you have security over there, you have network administrators over there. And you segment these people from each other and have that type of good, clean segmentation. But you have a company that's had a flat network for almost a decade, and people plug in wherever they can plug into. Then the network is an absolutely flat topology with no security baked into it whatsoever. And all of a sudden, along comes a vendor like this that says, well, we can actually put in policies and rules based on the device that's plugged in. If you have a Windows 7 system, it gets plugged in and say it's a standard group for users. If you have a server that gets plugged in, it gets put into a server subnet or server segmentation group profiles, whatever, you can set it up. And I think that is interesting, but unfortunately, I believe that people are buying these solutions because their network is fundamentally just foobarred. And they believe that this type of technology will automatically identify all their IoT devices, segment, quarantine them off properly, identify their servers, and do that all magically. But all of these things require setup on the front end. So it's almost like they're trying to solve a problem, but the only way that you can solve that problem of having a disorganized network is by organizing your network. And then these tools are effective because you can establish these solid groups. But it's not a good solution just to throw it in and hope that it's automatically going to handle it for you.
Right. And then, they also tout that it will help control IoT devices and their access to the cloud, which is what a lot of IoT security vendors are doing. And I think that's, somewhat not interesting and yet to be defined what the results will be from that type of technology.
Well, okay, so this is a question. What I don't understand. We're stopping the IoT devices or controlling their access to the cloud. Does that mean you're trying to control their access for getting updates, trying to get patches, trying to give metrics information out? What exactly does that mean? Or do you think that they're actually just throwing buzzwords at the wall at this point?
Probably the latter. But it's interesting you say that, John. I'm not ready to disclose the device just yet, but there is a device that does automatic firmware updates and does it really well. In fact, when they had a security vulnerability, I wouldn't call it a major high-risk security vulnerability, but there was a security vulnerability. They updated all their devices in 24 hours, and every single one of their customers was patched that had access to the internet. Yeah. And that's, to me, that's IoT security, right? It's baked into the product. And firmware and updates is just one part of that security architecture.
Mm-hmm. No, interesting.
Let's go in the way back machine now, all the way back to 2003, where Gartner analyst Richard, what's his name? Richard Thyme. I had it in here, and I meant to go qualify his name. Do you remember his name?
I honestly can't remember.
We interviewed him. We interviewed him on the show.
And he did not back off that statement.
And he was right. I think
he was.
You know what I'm saying?
I think the job description morphed, but let's get into that here in a little bit.
Yeah. So IDS and I will find his name. Richard Steinen. Richard Steinen. Steinen? Yeah. Steinen. We interviewed him. I should have known this. So 2003 Gartner analyst Richard Steinen declared IDS dead and told us that it was going to be completely obsolete by 2005. IDS managed to hang on for some time after that, but eventually Richard's prediction was pretty much correct. Now, he didn't necessarily say that it was going to die and go away completely, but be included in other technologies such as firewalls, which is something that we've seen, certainly. Then I think Palo Alto came along, and the rest is kind of history. I do think the word dead is overused when we talk about different security technologies, but if you look at the concept of IDS, intrusion detection, I believe that it's not so much dead as it is reincarnated in about 5 different technologies that spread intrusion detection across these 5 areas. So detecting the vulnerability, detecting the exploit, detecting the infection or execution, detecting the malware, and detecting the callback. And we've seen technologies in all of these areas. We've talked about them on the show. In fact, John and you and I own a company, Offensive Countermeasures, that is in number 5, detecting the callback. So I think that we've spread this detection of the intrusion to one single product or group like IDS, and we've spread it across 5 different areas. And as kind of an overview, the challenge is picking which ones in these areas and how you want to implement it in your network. But John, I don't know if you have comments there, and I want to dive into the 5 things in a little more detail as well.
So if we go back to what the heart was for network intrusion detection, the idea was to find attack patterns and then alert on them. But I think that's dead.
Well, I mean, in some of IDS too was detecting the vulnerability, which is the first one there as well, right? It would detect, you could configure Snort, for example, to detect conditions in your network that it wasn't actually someone exploiting it or a payload, but it was a condition in your network. Hey, there's an open telnet server. Hey, we can see that, right? So there was a detect the vulnerability component to intrusion detection. It's kind of like a precursor in the preventative phase, right? Or it's still in the detection phase, but hopefully you detect that condition before it's exploited.
Yes, and that's kind of like, the passive vulnerability scanning that Tenable does. But, I do think that idea of writing a signature for an exploit, if we go back to 2003, 2005, I don't think it died in 2005. I don't think it died until within the last 3 years for many organizations because they just don't see those technologies. But I like the idea of it reincarnated. It reincarnated as beacon analysis, which is what we like to do.
Right.
It reincarnated as built-in intrusion prevention modules. And more importantly, it got diffused, right? So network intrusion detection or intrusion detection is now a web application firewall, attack detection, and sometimes prevention, is now built into the firewall devices themselves. And you talk about a lot of these different cloud providers for managed services, not security services. They're now baking in threat intelligence feeds into their services that they offer for maintaining and monitoring different systems at different locations. So network intrusion detection or intrusion detection, it didn't die. It came back much stronger. It's just now baked into so many different things. It's not a discrete appliance anymore. It's now something that is baked into everything that we do. And that's the way it probably should have been from the beginning.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And my number 2 was detecting the exploit. And I can remember writing snort rules specifically that would look for specific patterns that was the actual exploit of a particular vulnerability, right? And that's different from detecting the vulnerability. We try and detect the exploit. It turns out that's hard, but I think some of that functionality has been built into firewalls today, and they actually do detect a certain number of exploits. I think more popular on the web application end, but there are still some networking ones that people are looking to detect today. I don't think that's the strongest area, though.
No, it's not.
It's the highest false positive rate, let's be honest.
It has a very high false positive rate. And also, on top of that, if you actually look at where most of the attacks hit, most of the attacks are coming through in email. And it's a link that you click and it exploits your browser through Flash or something. Or it's a payload dropper that drops in an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document with a macro and takes over a computer system.
Yeah.
A lot of that runs over SSL and intrusion detection systems. While for years they've had the capability of intercepting and inspecting SSL traffic, organizations just flat out didn't turn it on.
Right. So well, it doesn't scale very well.
No, well, not really. But if you break that up to like your web gateway, or excuse me, your email gateway, and maybe your web proxy, then it kind of offloads and diffuses that detective capability across multiple different devices if they're configured properly, which they almost never are.
Yeah, and then there's detecting the infection or execution, and we've talked about Dave Kennedy's company, right, as being an example of this. That don't worry about the vulnerability, don't worry about the exploit. Let's look at how it's infecting the system and look for that condition or that behavior and alert on that. And there are certainly solutions that exist there too in terms of detecting an intrusion. I think that's still a very viable method.
Yes, and I don't see that going away. Like I said, I absolutely love the idea of it's a zombie that keeps coming back stronger, because it's just not going to go anywhere. Now, the real question is, Paul, are we in a better position or a worse position than we were back in 2003?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Well, because then we talk about detecting the malware using a signature or behavior in air quotes. Can you detect the payload itself? AV tries to do this with largely not so successful, certainly in the early stages of an attack or when new malware comes out. That's always been the problem for AV. And then, of course, John, you and I have talked about detecting the callback, ignoring everything else that we've talked about in terms of detection and just looking for, hey, once it's on the system, how does it phone home? And looking for that behavior as well, which is what our AI Hunter product does. But I think now we have a different problem, right? I mean, we had problems when we had that IDS on the network. Right? I mean, I was, an IDS analyst. That was one of my specialties, and there was a lot of problems with it. There was a lot of false positives. There was a lot of false negatives, and it was incredibly difficult to tune because it was trying to do all of these things. But now that we can spread all of these things out into different technologies, the question becomes, so how do you pick? And what's best for you? And a lot of these individual things that now encompass intrusion detection, they have different forms. So you can do it on the endpoint. So there might be one way to detect malware. You can do that on the endpoint. You can do that on your web gateway, your web proxy. Do you do both? What do you monitor for on the network? Do you use intrusion prevention on the network? Where do you put all these pieces and how do they fit together? Is now the challenge that it's been spread out in all these areas and all these different products that all behave slightly differently, to be honest with you.
Well, and we're talking old stuff here, right? We're talking over a decade at this point. And I'm going to kind of channel in Marcus Random, right? And we love Marcus dearly. You worked with him for years. I'm faculty with him at IONS. And if we look at the mistakes that were made, AV's mistake was that it was signature-based. We were going to try to find signature of an evil piece of malware. IDS's major flaw, which was honestly missed in the Gartner article by Richard, was it was signature-based. Richard said it's going to be dead because intrusion prevention is where it's at. You just don't want to detect. You actually want to stop it. But it's even more flawed than that. If you look at AV, you look at IDS, and if you want to call those things dead, the reason why they're dead is because they're signature-based. And it goes back to Random's 6 dumbest ideas in computer security. And it's dumb idea number 2. Trying to enumerate badness is just not going to work. And that leads into some of the concerns that we have whenever we have like the hypervisor analysis. That hypervisor analysis can be badass. If you're looking into the hypervisor and you're able to look at memory and you're able to look at a computer system at a much lower level and hide from the malware doing that analysis, that can be great. But the fundamental problem is if you're looking for a static signature of a certain type of attack, you're going to lose every single time. So it's almost like, IDS never really died, but we now have this bad idea that's permeating into so many other different things, web application firewalls, hypervisor analysis, Internet of Things detection, and we're doing more and more of that blacklisting. And that's where I think people are making the mistake. Now, there are products that are doing better, but if we're looking at Cylance, we're looking at Bit9, we're looking like our stuff, which is looking for more heuristics and behavioral analysis of network traffic, trying to move away from that signature is where we need to go. But I still think we have this bad idea that's now permeated across everything from IDS and AV that still persists today.
Yeah, I mean, this is somewhat of a bold statement, right? But I think largely organizations are doing this, is changing the way they think about detecting intrusions in their network. And as the attack surface and the attackers evolve, our methods obviously need to evolve as well. But I think we're at a point where you really have to reevaluate how you're finding those bad things, to bring it back to Marcus Random, right? Enumerating them in a signature-based method is not the best way. But now we have all these different tools at our disposal, and how do we use them effectively to really reach that one common goal that we're all after, and everyone has this goal, right? I want to find the attackers in my network. I want to find the bad code running in my network, whether that be a payload from a targeted attack, whether that be, average, everyday, run-of-the-mill adware or malware. I want to find someone who is attacking my system more like a penetration tester, trying to get at my data. I guess you could call that more of a targeted attack, but we're trying to find the intrusions in our network. And how we do that today has changed so much over time. And you can almost look at what we do today and then what we're going to do tomorrow. That might be totally different. And I think that's one of the things that makes this, when we talk about intrusion detection, so challenging, is the rate at which it evolves and the complexity now that we have in looking for it. When security was a new thing and we had firewalls and an IDS, things were simple back then, right? I sound like the old curmudgeon, right? Like things were simple. I had my firewall, I had my IPS, my IDS rather, and I had a vulnerability scanner that I cobbled together, and that was your security program. And today, I mean, there's a lot more to your security architecture. And I wish I had general advice on where to go to today, but it's so dependent on your environment and how you operate.
And I think that gets to the crux of the issue. We talk about devices like Fortinet, right, doing that type of asset inventory discovery for Internet of Things. Forescout, where I see people try to implement it, they're basically saying, okay, we've got a problem. We don't know our network, and we're going to try to buy a product that's going to bring order to our network. And it never works that way. Mm-hmm. We don't know what traffic's leaving our environment, but we're going to buy a product that's going to watch the traffic leaving our environment to look for signatures of attack. And it's almost like we keep skirting around the issue. Go back years ago or even now today, the same thing is true. The networks that do the best from a resiliency perspective, whenever we're trying to actively attack those networks, without question, are the networks where the administrators and the security team know their stuff. And I'm not just talking they're technically sharp, like, they know how to use Metasploit. Or,
they know their network and their systems and how they behave. And when something falls out of that scope, they notice. And that's, I don't simplify that, right? I'm not saying that, you should know every connection in your network and when something deviates, but they just have, I know exactly what you're talking about. They're the people that have this kind of like keen sense, like they're Jedis, man. They're in tune with the Force and they can sense a disturbance in the Force in their network, Yep. Yeah. And it's tough to quantify that, like how do you, it's just like a thing, like the Force, right?
Well, and it's like we've been able to, I feel like we've been able to dial that in pretty good at BHIS and even at offensive countermeasures.
Yeah.
Is you sit down and you talk to people and you say, well, what do you do in the evening when you're not working? It's like, well, I program my Raspberry Pi to have a light sensor that whenever the light comes on, it kicks out a cockroach with a saddle and a little tiny man riding it. I mean, that's insane. But that person is spending a tremendous amount of time trying to learn their craft. If you talk to somebody and you say, well, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get into this network in a security position? They're going to be like, well, I'm going to use the Metasploits to attack the wire sharks. And they start throwing out buzzword after buzzword after buzzword. They're missing the point. But if they say, look, I'm going to try to learn the network, I'm probably going to spend the better part of a month doing nothing but trying to identify what the network segments are, what's on those networks, what does the traffic look like, what are the applications that we have. That's the person that you want.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back and I need to write a blog post about this because I said this on the Security Weekly show, and I think it's pertinent to our conversation here. Is that people have this belief that they can use this mystical technology and that will equate to security. And it all goes back to the scene in The Force Awakens, right? Where Han Solo asked Finn, well, what was your plan to break in? And he was like, I was going to use the Force. And Han goes, that's not how it works. And I feel like I have this conversation with people or in hear about people saying, well, I'm going to secure my network and I'm going to use XYZ technology. And I'm like, that's not how it works. And there's definitely a parallel there. And there's totally a blog post on that. But that's what I keep going back to.
I love that. That would be a good blog post. I had we were at an IANS forum I want to say it was in Boston. And this is before we had offensive countermeasures and AI Hunter and all those things. And we were talking about the core of that technology, which really started on Rita, and we developed the hell out of it. And I'm sitting here and I'm explaining this to this room of CISOs. One of the CISOs is like, I'm halfway through it, and I'm talking about how all these technologies can be bypassed, and this is how we got to change the approach. Mm-hmm. And he goes, that's all good, but I want a tool that automates all of that. Like, I just spent the last half an hour telling you that we can bypass these automated things. It just doesn't work. He goes, well, I have no interest in writing a check for anything that doesn't automate something in computer security. And at that point, the conversation's kind of done, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you're looking, it's interesting. We're talking about intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. And along the lines of this conversation, and John, you have had this conversation where people are like, well, I want a product that I can put in my environment and I go to it every day and it tells me about all the computer systems in my environment that have been compromised. That's not how it works, right?
No.
I wish it did, but it just doesn't work that way.
And if we had a product that did that, you and I would not be on this podcast. Well, we probably would be on this podcast, but we'd be on a beach doing this podcast. Mm-hmm. A beautiful beach somewhere in the Caribbean.
No, on our own island.
On our own island, yes. Made of floating money. Why is the sand green? Those are shredded up $1,000 bills. But how do people get away from that? Like, and I love our audience, especially for this show. Don't get me wrong. I love the people at Security Weekly. That's great. We get on Security Weekly and we're all breaking things, right? Everything can be broke. We like to get into the wings and nuts. But a lot of the people that have been writing in for this show are like, I have to actually make decisions on how to buy things. And I think that what you learn from this particular segment is, does it say it does a specific thing? Is it a magic unicorn security tool? Or does it give you better visibility into your network? If it gives you better visibility and allows you to make better decisions, it's a great tool. It's a great product. But if it's this magical unicorn box, then it's probably not going to be in your network 18 months from now. And that's something, have you thought about how long on average these hot new security products stay in networks? I've noticed it's anywhere between 18 months and 24 months. And then they're ripped out with some kind of other new hotness.
Right. It'll be interesting to see as time goes on who the security vendors and providers are that are able to stay in the network for longer than that and keep up with the evolution. Or maybe that's just where we're at with security. Maybe 2 years is it, and so much has changed during that time that you need something completely new.
Yep. And I think it goes back to the beginning of this segment. IDS isn't dead. It's just evolving.
Right.
And it's spreading into other things. But please don't feed the trolls. Don't feed the idea of signature-based magic boxes. It's all about awareness. And that's something Mike Poore spends a lot of time talking about in his class, intrusion detection. He likes to make the joke, if intrusion detection was truly dead, then why is SANS 503 network intrusion detection still like the top 3 or top 4 selling class at the SANS Institute?
Yep.
It's not dead. It's just different. And most of his class is about awareness, knowing packets, knowing attack patterns, knowing how to parse TCP flow, knowing your network segmentation. That's what's important, and that's the core of it.
Absolutely. Well, that concludes this edition of Enterprise Security Weekly. You can go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. Check out all of our shows and get links to subscribe to all of our shows, including this one on iTunes, Playcast, Google Play, and much more. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching.